Welcome to God is Open. I'm your host, Christopher Fisher. Today on God is Open, we're going to be talking about translating language, translating words. Now, not long ago on this channel, I had an individual that was fairly irate with me because he was insisting one of the passages that I talked about had a particular meaning that was different than the meaning that I was claiming in that phrase or those words. And he claimed to me, he said, I went and I talked to someone who's fluent in Hebrew, and this is what they said that these words mean. And then he demanded that I go ask my dad what those words mean. So categorically, I pointed this out to him, and it didn't seem to get through his head that categorically this is a mistake. This is not how language works or operates. Just think about how English works. If you go to a native English speaker and ask them a definition of the word, especially if they don't have context, and even if they do have context, it's a shot in the dark whether or not they're going to hit what that word means. Context helps. Context gives meaning. Dictionaries, you could look at a dictionary for the definition of the word, but often without context, that dictionary definition is not going to be helpful. It'll give you some ideas of what that word might mean. How dictionaries are written is individuals look into how words are used across a variety of contexts, and they write possible definitions. So they are doing some basic detective sleuthing work to even create these dictionaries. This type of sleuthing work we ourselves can do, and it's not like a dictionary definition is going to override normal and natural contextual use of words that we ourselves can see. So dictionaries are helpful for guiding, for giving suggestions, for giving you some basic ideas, but context is going to be key. And we'll be covering that today. Joel Hoffman over here will be talking about 3 wrong ways to translate. And it's a fairly good lecture that he has. It's a TED Talk, one of those off TED Talks, but longtime listeners of the channel know that I reference this fairly often. This is one to watch just to understand some basics about words and translations. Categorically, it's a mistake to go to a speaker of Greek or Hebrew or any language to ask them the definition of the word and to have that override your own contextual studies of how words are used in their context. What people who speak the language are very good at and very useful for is things that are a little bit more complex. Maybe grammar, maybe syntax, maybe conjugation of verbs, declining nouns. Those types of nuances that you might not think about. Word definitions is not going to be their strong suit. Even people who write dictionaries, you have to treat with some level of skepticism. That's not how language works. You could do the same research that they're doing for those dictionary definitions. Dictionaries, it's not like people in the English language consult a dictionary before they use a word. If someone says, oh, that's the cat's meow, it's like, well, what does that mean? That there's a cat with some sort of meow, and then, no, that doesn't make any sense. What's going on there? It's idiomatic. And idiomatic, you could probably tell from the context that you're calling something cool or calling something you're exalting something on some level. So context gives meaning. And let's look at a practical example of that in the Bible. Let's pull up Hosea 11:12. Now, I was listening to a pastor give a sermon on Hosea 11, and he comes to this verse, and it says, Ephraim has surrounded me with lies, the house of Israel has surrounded me with deceit, but Judah still roams about God, he remains faithful to the Holy One. Now, that's the net. Let's look at the ESV and King James. But Judah still walks with God and is faithful to the Holy One. Wow, that sounds pretty good for Judah. Let's look at the New King James. But Judah still walks with God, even with the Holy One who is faithful. The problem is the entire context is about how evil Judah is. So this is a major departure from contextually what it's talking about with Judah. And so the pastor I was listening to was very confused. He didn't know what was going on, and he did his best to try to explain what he thinks it means, full well knowing that contextually Judah's very evil. Let's go look at the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society. And Judah is yet wayward towards God and towards the Holy One who is faithful. Now, this is probably more accurate. Let's turn to the biblical word commentary on this verse and see what they say. This is the full verse. Ephraim has surrounded me with deceit, and the family of Israel with fraud, and Judah remains unruly against me, even against the faithful Holy One. Judah remains unruly against me. All the other ones are saying Judah walks with God. Notice this is a complete reversal of the meaning. So hinging on one word, it negates the entire sentence. One translator who knows Hebrew, understands Hebrew, is fluent in Hebrew, translates it in a positive, and another person who also speaks Hebrew, knows Hebrew, translates it in a complete 180 method. Let's see what he says about this. The text of 1b is probably corrupt. 11:12, or chapter 11, verse 12 is renumbered 12:1 in the Hebrew Bible. So the text of 1b is probably corrupt. The Masoretic text is uncertain as to the meaning, although it appears in some context to mean Rome or the like. Unruly is a conjecture. So he's saying that it probably means to roam. It probably means something contextually fitting about Judah being awful, not being good, not actually working with God. And Judah remains unruly against God, even against the faithful Holy One. So we'll find that in English as well. So someone might say, hey, that's sick right there. And people are like, that's sick? Sick is this, it's a bad word. It's has this bad meaning. Well, contextually, it's a good thing. And so context has more meaning than dictionary definitions. So turning to Joel Hoffman, let's hear him say basically the same things.
In particular, they used three wrong ways to figure out what the ancient languages mean. And it's helpful to look at those three ways because they are not the only translators to use these three wrong ways. Modern Bible translations, too, use these wrong ways to figure out what the ancient texts mean. So we look at the three wrong ways, not just to figure out the King James Version and what goes wrong when you read that, but what goes wrong pretty much in any Bible translation that you read. Now, in order to figure out if we've got it right or not, we need some metric of success. We have to know if our method is accurate or not. And we can't do that with the usual way, which is to ask somebody. Normally, if I want to know if I've got French right, I go to Paris and I test it out and I talk to people who speak French and I see if I've got it right. We can't do that with ancient Hebrew and ancient Greek, the languages of the Bible, because inconveniently everybody who speaks those languages has died. And they're no longer available to answer our questions, so we need another way to figure out if we...
Right, and this is something that people will object about. They'll say, "Oh, there's still Hebrew speakers, and there's still Greek speakers." Well, language changes. It's not the same language. Let's just take a look at English, for example. I got pulled up Luke 2 in the Old English, Middle English, and Early Modern English, the King James English, and it's barely legible from one to the other. So Early Modern English, and it came to pass with a E, in those days with an E, that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. The Middle English is, for so it is done in 4 days is manumendant went out fro Caesar Augustus pate all p world should be discrued. I probably pronounced that all wrong because these are weird characters that I'm not familiar with. Old English, Soflis on plam degum wes gui warden giobod fram pam Caesar Augusto piet et yem bella wefri were Tom Arsad. I know the F's used to be like S's, something like that. Like there's the band Goaty Hook, and Goaty Hook basically they used archaic ways of writing to write fishhook, and that's how we got the band Goaty Hook. And so if you're familiar with that punk band. But language changes. We can't even read. If we had a time machine back to those days, we would probably be barely able to converse. No one alive speaks ancient Greek or ancient Hebrew. A lot of this is recreations and conjectures.
We've gotten it right. Fortunately, one thing we learned last century from linguistics is that languages are fundamentally all the same. That is to say, even though their details differ drastically, their fundamental structure is all the same. They all work basically the same way, and that's good news. That means if we look at a modern language, or if we look in fact at all modern languages and find that a method of inquiry is successful, we know it's successful for ancient languages as well. If we look at a method of inquiry and find that it does not work for modern languages, we assume it didn't work for ancient
Yeah, and that is a fair assumption.
languages either. So with that in mind, we can look at the three wrong ways of figuring out what the ancient text meant. The first one is etymology. Anyone here ever study etymology? Where words come from?
Yeah, pastors will do this all the time. They'll stand up in front of their congregation and they'll break down a word and say, oh, this word comes from this word and combined with this word and it means this and then this. And so that's what the meaning of this first word is. They look at the origin or the constructs in the word themselves. This is a wrong way of doing translation. It could be helpful if you have nothing else to go on. It might give you some direction, but fundamentally that's not going to give you truth. It might point you there, but it's not good.
From sort of it's a lot of fun for the sort of person who finds that sort of thing fun. It's where words come from, and because people sometimes like looking at it, people sometimes think that etymology tells you what a word means, and it does not. It tells you what a word maybe used to mean. For example, the English words grammar and glamour come from the same source etymologically. Now, thinking back to middle school, how many of you remember grammar as being particularly glamorous? And once again, I'm the only person raising my hand. I actually sort of get that a lot with that question, but what are you going to do? So we see that etymology does not tell us what the words. Another real good example comes from the two words, comes from medieval monks, who would copy things over by hand because they didn't have Xerox machines, obviously. They didn't even have mimeograph machines. Anyone remember mimeograph machines? I see yeah, so you'd go like this and you'd have to move things around. I see a couple of people, yeah. They didn't have them back in the Middle Ages, and the monks were copying over their manuscripts. And so they had to copy the manuscripts over by hand, and they didn't do it inside the monastery because the monasteries were too dark. They'd go outside and set up booths or tables, and they copied the manuscripts over there at what became known as stationary booths or immobile booths. As more and more Europeans learned how to read and write, more and more Europeans needed writing supplies, and they had two choices. They could either make them themselves, or they could buy them from people who had the writing supplies. Well, who had the writing supplies? The monks. And where were the monks? At the stationary booths. And the supplies became known as stationary supplies. This is a true story. It is, I think, an interesting story, and it highlights the fact that etymology does not tell us what the words mean. The E and the A came later. One of them is spelled with an E, one of them is spelled with an A. I'm pretty sure when you're not looking, they switch them just to keep you on your toes. Might be me. I went to an open classroom school, I should tell you, where they sort of asked me what I wanted to learn instead of telling me what I should learn, as a result of which I didn't learn anything. And the only good news is that because I went to the open classroom school, I feel very good about myself and don't care that I don't know anything. But you know, spelling, arithmetic, geography, way beyond me. Point though is stationary with an E, stationary with an A, come from the same source, showing us that etymology does not tell us what words mean. That's the first wrong way to figure out what the ancient words mean. Second wrong way to figure out what the ancient words mean is internal structure. Now this has a particularly rich form in Hebrew, which is why people like it so much in Hebrew, but again we'll look at the examples in English and look at how internal structure does not tell us what the words mean. In English we have a word host. A host is someone who welcomes you or someone who's in charge. Lauren is our host, and I call her hostess, but she's our host. On the pattern of infant, infantile, what would you think about host and hostile? You might think that if an infant is infantile, that a host should be hostile, and of course you would be wrong. What we see is that internal structure does not tell us what the words mean. Another example comes from the word patent, which by definition is non-obvious. You cannot patent something that's obvious, and yet patently means obviously. Even something so simple as adding ly to a word does not tell us what the word means.
Yeah, that's important. Even slight variations of words might change the meaning. dramatically.
This also applies, incidentally, not just to words, but to phrases. Internal structure for phrases are one of the biggest traps in figuring out what the ancient languages mean. So, for example, in English, we have a word pick, which means to open surreptitiously. We have a word like to pick a lock. We have a word up, which means away from gravity. And we have a word on, which means away from gravity and touching that which is beneath it. This will not tell you that pick up means to increase, like pick up the tempo. That pick on means to annoy, or that pick up on means to discern. Another real good example is the drive-through window, which quite obviously doesn't mean what you might expect it would. So we find that internal structure does not tell us what the words mean, along with etymology not telling us what the words mean. And the final example, final wrong way of figuring out what the ancient languages mean is cognate languages. It's tempting to think that if you know what one word means in one language, and if you have a similar word in a different language, you can just extrapolate it.
Yeah, like in Spanish, embarazado does not mean I'm embarrassed. It means that you're pregnant. So we're going to skip through that. So bad ways to know what words mean: internal structure, etymology, and cognates. So I think he's a little bit dramatic here. I think that it might point us in the right direction if we have nothing else to go on. But the correct way to interpret language, he points out, is in fact context. We're going to go to the context.
Fortunately, we're not done. There is a reliable way to figure out what the ancient texts mean, and that is context. Almost by definition, a word's meaning is how it is used in context. And I'll give you an example. In English, we have a word sincerely at the bottom of a business letter, and all that really means is my name comes next. It does not imply any particular degree of sincerity, and here's how I know. Suppose you've got a startup, and you are trying to explain how the $105,000 sports car that you just got for your brother really is a legitimate business expense. And so you fill a letter with 4 paragraphs of lies, and then you sign the letter, which you've of course written to the Internal Revenue Service. You sign the letter sincerely, in spite of the lies. They of course write you back and say, yeah, you're going to jail. And how do you respond to the people who are ruining your life? Dear, right. So we see that the words don't get their meaning from their literal meaning, but rather from how they are used in context. Other languages sign letters differently, and Hebrew, for example, says b'chavod, literally with honor. B'chavod doesn't mean with honor, it just means sincerely. And this will actually help us figure out what went so wrong with my sister, my bride. Which fortunately is not incest in Song of Songs. We're not going to have time for my bride or for my spouse, though as it happens, in Song of Songs there is no notion of commitment between these two people. They are essentially hooking up. Wait till the fundamentalists find out.
All right, so he does give us some indication. Context gives meaning. And so any particular word, you have to pull it up and pull up the sentence, see how it's used in the various contexts in which that word is used, that phrase is used, and see how they're using that. Jackie Moore has a really good book on deleting elect from the Bible, in which he goes through how the word elect is being used. And when I looked up the word elect in pagan sources, it's basically you send your elect troops out into battle first. These are your best troops. These are the ones who are going to be the heaviest fighters. You pick the elect stones to build your bridge. These are the best stones. These are the ones that actually can fit in the right places and build a sturdy bridge. So election does not mean some sort of Calvinist notion of picking someone from time eternal. This is more about picking the right people, the correct things for the particular purpose. And so election is not this arbitrary choosing of God, right? And there's none of the contexts in the Bible which point to that. This is an arbitrary definition that Calvinists have imposed on this word and other words. We have a show on the Calvinist Dictionary in which we go over various words that have been hijacked by Calvinists: predestination, foreknowledge, elect, sovereign, these types of things. That they've been hijacked and been given a meaning that the context doesn't support. And we're basically being gaslit into believing these things. And a dictionary might even give those definitions. So predestination is an interesting one because there are pagan sources using it for like prophecy type words, but there's also pagan sources that don't use it in that way or context. And so any particular context in which that word is being used needs to be consulted. It doesn't automatically mean whatever the Calvinist claims it means. It means whatever the context suggests that it means. Context defines words. Words can add to context, but you don't go to a dictionary to figure out what a word means in context. You go to a dictionary to see what the word possibly might mean within that particular context. But as we see, Joel Hoffman points out that sometimes the word doesn't have the dictionary meaning. Maybe it has no meaning whatsoever. And sometimes maybe it's the opposite meaning of what's being communicated. Maybe it's being used in an interesting way, like in Hosea, where instead of walking with God, it's wandering away from God because Judah was evil. In the context, Judah is wayward. Judah is not walking with God. He's walking away from God, and that's how it should be translated. So context gives meaning, not dictionaries, not random people who say they speak the ancient language, which they don't. Those don't give meaning. We don't get meaning from etymology or internal structure or even cognates. We get definitions from context. So context is key. If I go to a Hebrew scholar, I'm looking for grammar. I'm looking for syntax. I'm looking at conjugation. And even then, these scholars disagree. Remember Chris Date, supposed our Hebrew speaker, when he tried to call me out on me calling him out about using the exact same phrase used about God, that's also used about man, that he inhabits eternity. The same phrase is used about man. And he tried to call me out on grammar issues, and a Hebrew scholar wrote back defending me, saying that I was correct. It is the same phrase. So even these people disagree. I think we saw that also when we were talking about Acts 13:32 with David Paulman, when he was trying to take me to task, saying nobody translates it reflexively. And he gave me a list of scholars, and I pulled them all up, and they all disagree. And some of them did hand waving for my definition, and some of them agreed fully it could be how I was translating it. They were all over the place, even on grammar and even on the syntax. Scholars disagree, and that's what you're going to find. And so turning to one scholar, turning to one individual and saying, he says this, therefore it's true, you still got to use your brain. You still got to look at the context and to see, is that plausible? Is it possible? What are other alternatives, and what's most likely? We don't hinge ourselves in appealing to authority. We don't hinge ourselves in pointing to dictionaries. We use our brain to understand language. Language is complex. Language is fluid. Language is dynamic. The meaning of words varies tremendously on how it's being used, in what context it's being used. Is it being used sarcastically? Is it being used idiomatically? These are the things we have to consider. You're not going to find one definitive right answer. You need to make actual arguments for your position rather than appeals to authority. Anyways, that's what I wanted to talk about today, the use and translating of languages. So watch the full Joel Hoffman Interpreting Language video. It's very good to kind of cue you in. I also read his book, God Didn't Say That, and that also is a good addition to your collection. So if you have any questions or comments on this, put that down below or start a thread on the God is Open Facebook group. Thank you for listening.